Okay, so if you're joining, please put yourself on mute. I see everyone is on mute. We are on almost the last session, one before. It's introduction to HemeLB. We have John here. John, the stage is yours to start.
Thank you, very much appreciated. There we go. Okay. So today I'll be giving some introduction to the HemeLB code, I guess a bit of background to some of the algorithms behind it, how it's deployed on CPU and GPU clusters, its performance, and some applications that it's being used for. So to start with acknowledgement. So this is by no means my own work. The HemeLB code has been in development in one sort of another for the best part of the last 20-odd years. Much of that has been done through the Peter Coveney's group at UCL. Some of the more recent work has been done by myself and the colleagues listed there. So Janus Ballant have done particularly a lot of work in the conversion from the original CPU version to GPU. Sharp and Xiao have been doing work on applications with the code. And some of the visualizations that are presented later in this presentation come from the collaboration that came with LRZ along the way. So some of the projects and supercomputers that this code has been run on are mentioned here. And yeah, all of their contributions and support are gratefully acknowledged. So pardon me, I get a bit of background about myself. So I come from an engineering and science background. So my degrees are in mechanical engineering and mathematics. And I went on to do a PhD in the LBMDM modeling of particle suspensions in oil and gas. So what we're looking at here is we're using the Lattice-Boltzmann method to model a fluid phase. We've got solid particles suspended within that and looking at some multi-physics problems of how to transport those particles within confined domains. After I finished my PhD, I was a postdoc for 5.5 years at UCL in London in Peter Coveney's group, working with the HemeLB code and using it to do 3D simulations of blood flow in human scale vasculatures. So we're looking at very large domains, so human scale vessels from, in some cases, whole body domains, others large representations of significant sections of vessels within the body. And so since October 2024, I've been a lecturer at Queen's University in Belfast in the School of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering. So my research here is continuing what I was doing in the postdoc, where simulating biomedical flows. We're good? Yep, no worries. Okay, so continuing on biomedical flows alongside teaching in fluid mechanics. So to motivate some of the use cases for HemeLB, so we're going to start, I want to bring up the topic of an idea of a digital twin. So some of you may have heard of this concept in industry processes where you have a numerical representation of some physical object or process. And so you're able to conduct what-if analysis to enable things, for example, in the life of a jet engine, for example, when do maintenance intervals need to be scheduled? Which parts may need to be replaced? How can performance of that engine be optimized for given conditions? And so we can extend these ideas to the virtual human, which is the idea of a digital twin of the human body. And so we're wanting to simulate processes throughout from the molecular scale, for example, of how drug interactions might occur for an individual person to determine if they've got this type of cancer or this type of illness, whether this drug will work for them, up to whole human scale and indeed multi-human scale simulations. So whole human scale is like what we're talking about in the blood flow, where you're simulating things across and between organs. And multi-human scale can be up to, for example, epidemiological modeling of illnesses. And so the use of these digital simulation models is motivated because every individual is different. So I'll speak on this later on in the presentation, but why shouldn't healthcare models also cater to the individual? And so individual anatomical features can vary widely between individuals. So you're able to look at what the particular condition is for an individual person. You can optimize treatments for those. You can provide potential advice for both how to return them to wellness and how to maintain a state of healthy existence. And there's also communication and confidence. So being able to, for doctors and clinicians to be able to communicate to patients what is the medical issue that they're experiencing, how can it be treated, how can it be better understood, and why they're doing particular treatments to them. So there is from the Comp Biomed project that finished a couple of years ago, there is a video on YouTube where this animation comes from. But if you're interested in hearing more about this virtual human twin concept, I would suggest you have a look at that video. So about the HemeLB solver itself. So it looks at blood flow in the body. And so in terms of a virtual human environment, this is a way to firstly couple different organs. So blood needs to flow from the heart to the organs in the body, to the brain, feed the muscles, feed the tissues, and then return back through the lungs, be oxygenated, and so on. So the blood flow, a good blood flow model is a way to couple together multiple different organs in a virtual human environment. And so you need a model that is able to run efficiently in that environment. And so HemeLB is one approach for potentially doing that. So it solves the fluid flow within the vessels at a with the lattice-Boltzmann method. It has been particularly optimized for the sparse geometries that are characteristic of these vascular geometries. So having a look at some of the images on the right-hand side of the screen there. So because the vessels are relatively sparse in space, you have a lot of empty space in the ultimate periphery of the vessels. And so this requires challenges in how you represent your flow domain and how you model your input and output data. So HemeLB has been used in studies in a whole range of existing flows, for example, in stent flows, in magnetical particle transport for drug delivery, and wall shear stress analyses in a range of vessels. From a technical point of view, it's the original CPU version is a C++ code that has been parallelized with MPI. And subsequently, GPU versions have been developed based on this framework for use with NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel flavored GPU hardware. So I will try and limit the scary equations that come up on these slides, but some is necessary. So HemeLB uses the lattice-Boltzmann method. And so what we're solving here, so these two equations at the top here, the notation isn't important for this particular case, but it is continuity. So you're solving conservation of mass, and the Navier-Stokes equations, you're solving conservation of momentum. And these are the fundamental equations that you're needing to solve for fluid flows. And when you hang around to the open foam talk in the next hour's time, they're also solving these exact same equations, but they're doing it in a very different way. And that has consequences on how open foam and HemeLB, even though they might be able to simulate the same domain, they have very different performance characteristics. How the lattice-Boltzmann method solves these equations is, instead of solving the macroscopic variables, so your pressures and your velocities directly, its main variable are these F populations, which represent a probability of a certain amount of mass of fluid being transported in a certain direction in a certain time. Okay, there we go. And so you have a certain number of these at each lattice point, so each node in your domain. These are evolved with time in a collision step and then streamed to do a temporal update. And then the summation of these points, so the so-called moments of these points, is how you then resolve your macroscopic densities, pressures, and momentum and velocity. So breaking that down, so the actual algorithmic step, so you have the collision step where they're updated in terms of the space, and then they're streamed to their neighbors to update in time. Then this stream collide step is how you update things, update your flow over a transient period of time. When we're dealing with boundary conditions, we need to somehow reconstruct the incoming populations that come from outside the domain. And there's a whole art to writing boundary conditions in order to capture these particular unknown quantities for your pressure and velocity boundary conditions. So there's a bit of a algorithmic summary. So you initialize your quantities initially. You start with a equilibrium. You do your collide and stream, you provide your boundary conditions, you have your new values, you update your moments, you get macroscopic quantities. And so then this cycle is just repeated over and over again across a whole domain over your simulation duration. In some of the notes that are already out there, so I suggest using a quantity called MLOPS to evaluate performance of the HemeLB of a lattice Boltzmann code. And so this is millions of lattice updates per second. And so a single lattice update is doing this step once for your whole domain. And so if you've got 1 million cells, 1 million sites in your domain, so your how many updates is doing this for each site for one single time step. In HemeLB, we break up the different types of nodes based on where they're located within the domain. And this has consequences on how the collision and streaming process works within them. So we have inner domain nodes. So these are the yellowy colored ones here in our domain. They're the ones that are just fluids. They have no links to outer surfaces in any way. Then we have walls, which are the dark green colors. Sorry, there's some live timing on these slides, which I forgot to get rid of. So we have these walls. They're the ones adjacent to the boundaries, the edges of our domain. We have the blue just inlets and outlets, and then we have the red ones, which are corner nodes, which are adjacent to both an inlet or an outlet and a wall. And so when we have converted the code to a GPU version, there has been some combination of these individual steps in order to get a more efficient deployment of the code on GPU by going, okay, we know that the fluid sites, for example, are going to take the most time, so we can somehow collect all the other ones together to work in the background to better utilize the GPU in a more efficient way. And so the collision of these collide stream boundary condition kernels have been put into specific kernels in the GPU. And so if you do any profiling on the GPUs, you'll see things that are like, as I say, fluids plus wall sites, for example, as one of the main kernels that are occurring. And that's what it's doing. It is doing the updates of these sites, which are as labeled. So a bit from a historical perspective, the HemeLB code was first converted from CPU into CUDA for execution on NVIDIA GPUs. And then there was a next step, which used, I guess, what we called the hipification of it. So using the HIP-SYCL conversion process to get it running on both AMD and NVIDIA GPUs. And this is the version that we are asking you to use in the cluster competition. And so HIP is AMD's version of things, AMD's version of the CUDA environment for NVIDIA, and it allows execution on both taking a GPU code written in CUDA and then allowing it to be portable and target on different applications. In many cases, there are some conversion scripts that allow conversion from a CUDA code to a HIPified code, where basically the CUDA calls are being replaced with HIP calls. So there are some automated tools available to do this. They claim 89% of your code is converted, but that remaining 10% has a lot of work to tidy up the loose ends of where the conversion is missed and make sure things work. And Jan has put in a lot of effort to make this happen. And so we have this version that can run on both NVIDIA or AMD GPUs using the same code base. So in terms of the performance that we're looking at here, so we're using a domain of the circle of Willis. So this is what this structure is here. So it is a production type domain, so not a trivial domain in this case. This is a vascular structure within your brain. And so I'll talk a bit more about this particular structure in a couple of slides' time. And so this particular geometry that we're using had over 10 billion sites, ladder sites, and we ran it for 5,000 steps. And so what we have here is comparisons between a CPU-only machine. So this is run on the SuperMOOC NG machine, CPU-only, almost 310,000 cores. And compared to at the time, the fastest machine in the world when we generated this data, on the Summit machine, on almost 18,500 V100 GPUs. And so what we're seeing here is when you convert the two codes to an equivalent compute hardware unit, so which is a SM, a streaming multiprocessor in the GPU itself. So you're continuing a linear scaling property, but at a much higher scale on the GPU than what we're achieving in the blue CPU results. In both cases, we're seeing near linear scaling up to a certain point, which is where the communication that you're needing to do is outweighing the actual compute time. And so you're seeing a drop off in performance at very large core counts. So in the CPU version, this starts happening at about a bit over 100,000 cores. The GPU version, we're looking at 512,000 streaming multiprocessors. I can't remember off the top of my head how many GPUs that converts down to. Might be about 10,000 GPUs, give or take. And so some improvements in the CPU code around intrinsics gain further improvements in the code. So looking at some more recent developments, so not just the Summit results, so the Circle of Willis results that we are seeing here on the V100, so the closed yellow squares there, the same results from the previous slide. But here we're comparing to, for example, some results on Frontier on using AMD GPUs and some preliminary results on Intel GPUs as well. And we're seeing similar characteristics for the entire code performance running on a range of different hardwares at very large GPU counts. So because of the strong scalability performance of HemeLB on both CPU and GPU architectures, there has been interest from hardware manufacturers and HPC centers for HemeLB to be used as a benchmarking code for when they're wanting to know how do our clusters, how do our machines, how do our hardware run at very large scales. And to run very large scales, you need a code that can actually reach that performance level, which we can in many cases with HemeLB. And so there has been interest from NVIDIA, from AMD, and from UK sources as well as supercompute centers. In terms of other industry impacts, so the recent PhD thesis of Sharp Low, so he finished second half of late last year. So it involved coupling the HemeLB code with the ALIA multi-physics model, which was developed by originally Barcelona Supercomputing Center and then as a spin out through the LM Biotech company. So that was looking at coupling heart model and vascular models, extending towards this idea of a virtual human using multiple high-performance computing systems and codes. So then the remaining few slides that I'll go through are looking at some applications of the code. So some scientific applications in particular. So in one case here so this is some work that I was focused on. So this is looking at that circle of Willis geometry. And so the anatomically complete version of the circle of Willis, that if you opened up an anatomical textbook, would look something like this image here. However, you survey large populations of people and maybe only 10 to 12% of the population actually present with this full geometry. Indeed, some more common geometries are actually missing one of these vessels. So if we're looking, let's see, can I get a laser pointer? Not today. So if you look in just on this bottom left here, so we're missing a connecting vessel between coming from the basal artery at the rear here to the front of the brain vessels here. And in this case here, we're missing one on the right-hand side. And so significant portions of the population actually present with missing vessels such as these. In some case, they might be missing both. in one study, there's 47 different variations depending on vessels that are missing or different connections that are made throughout the brain. And so when you start seeing those vessels all the time, this starts to blur into more something like that. And so the study that we're looking at here applied different types of stroke scenario to these different vascular structures to see how well or how differently the blood flow was distributed to the peripheral brain tissue in people with these different types of vascular presentations. And so we're looking at 170 million laticytes for each of these domains, simulating approximately 3 seconds of physical time over the duration of the stroke. And this took about 10 hours on the CPU machine SuperMORC NG. Why do we want to know about this? So the basilar artery, so we were doing a stroke, a blockage of the basilar artery, this vessel at the back here. And it's relatively infrequent, but is a high mortality case, high mortality rate variation of stroke. And so if you can identify patients that are at risk before a stroke happens, you can give them options to improve their treatment and outcomes. And so doing some visualization work, we have the healthy case, missing the vessel on the left, missing the vessel on the right. And so in a healthy vessel, when you have a stroke, the flow in these vessels towards the tissue at the rear of the brain get about 60% of what they would in a healthy non-stroke case. When one of these vessels are missing, this drops to about 40%. And so straight away, with no other differences being accounted for, people that present with these types of vascular geometries have a significantly higher risk of disability or death following a stroke, just by how the change in blood flow distribution occurs due to their anatomical construction of the vessels in their brain. And so one way of viewing these is actually having these as animated visuals. And so a consequence of how the lattice-Boltzmann method works, it's very good at being parallelized. And so you can get the strong scaling performance that I was talking about previously. But the consequence is it stores a lot of data, and writing data can be quite intense. So these videos you're looking about over 0.5 terabyte of data just to generate these 75 frames for these two images. And what we're seeing here is the stroke as it happens. So there is a blockage in the basilar artery, which is this vessel at the back here and at the bottom of this image here. And you're seeing how the flow changes from, and you see the activation of these missing vessels. So this is in a healthy case. And so you can see the activation of this connecting vessel here when the vessel blocks, where instead of flow going just up through these other vessels, it gets diverted around, and how the healthy vessel should occur when there's no supplementary flow coming through the basilar artery. Coupling the codes. So this is the work that was done by Sharp-Lowe that I mentioned previously. And so this is coupling a cardiac model, multi-physics model. So it does electrophysiology for passing the electro signals through the muscle of the heart. It has solid mechanics for the actual motion of the heart wall, and it has fluid mechanics of the blood being pumped out of the ventricle. And so then we were coupling this by passing data between the outlet of the heart and the inlet of the aorta, which is modeled in HemeLB to capture the vascular hemodynamics. And so this isn't just there are extra complications in how this coupling was occurring, in that ALIA is a Fortran code that does finite elements, and HemeLB is a lattice-Boltzmann code that is in C++. So you're not just coupling between codes, you're coupling between coding languages, and you're coupling between algorithmic methodologies. And so what Sharp was doing was a relatively simple coupling, so just writing to and from files and being able to read those between the different codes, and getting the flow rate and pressures being passed between the two codes and two domains in a reliable way. And so we have a coupling between the ejection phase of the heartbeat as it pumps flow out of the system, out of the ventricle into the aorta. And we have a video here. It's going to play. There we go. So as the ventricle contracts and pumps out, that is then being passed into the aorta and through the HemeLB simulation. So, and again, so the heart contracts, blood's pumped out, and then you can see its waveform as it's going through the aorta in the HemeLB simulation. And so we have some performance figures on the HemeLB node. So ALIA was able to run on a single node, but HemeLB, being a much larger simulation, was being run on multiple nodes. And we have some comparisons of the actual running of the time step and the actual coupling within them. So the actual coupling approach was relatively low, was very low. So in terms of coupling, there wasn't much overhead to get this information being passed between the two domains. And so what we're seeing is, as a result of actually having the 3D physical vessels being attached to the ALIA model, we're seeing differences in the cardiac muscle displacement than compared to a standalone model. So you are seeing differences in the simulation outcomes by having a more realistic blood flow simulation and the coupling of the vessels as they would be in a human being. So some future work that's going on for HemeLB is improving the wall physics. So how do we actually represent what's going on at the edges of the domain? There's potential use for HemeLB as a training tool for clinicians. So if they want to, for example, they're inserting stents into vessels in the brain. And so potentially we could use HemeLB as a training tool for them to get practice in a numerical environment, using the tools to be able to get practice in steering the biomedical tools to get a placement of a stent within a particular area of the brain. There's some technical burdens that need to be overcome, and we're working on ways to improve that. The changing balance of hardware. So as GPUs are advancing, they're getting more and more bandwidth, and so this is changing how the types of execution and what it means to be an optimized performance on a particular set of hardware, and that's changing from when we first implemented the GPU versions of HemeLB. And there's also been using these high fidelity simulations. So here's some simulations that Xia did, doing some high resolution and turbulent flows within the aorta, and particularly aorta with a coarctation, so a narrowing of the aorta and the turbulence that's arising out of that, and using this to train machine learning models so that high resolution simulations can be done on more efficient compute resources. And this is important because in many clinical applications, clinicians won't have access to a HPC environment behind a hospital firewall. So you need tools that are validated, verified, and you understand their numerical characteristics to be able to run on lighter weight hardware where they can use it without compromising patient data. So the problem that you'll be doing in the virtual task. So firstly, building the HemePure version of HemeLB, and with pressure boundary conditions. So we're applying pressure conditions at both inlets and outlets. So you've been provided with a bifurcation, so a simple Y bifurcation as a tiny case. So this is just to test your builds, make sure they're running, have an idea of how the simulation output from HemeLB looks, how to use your post-processing technique, so how to extract data from it, how to visualize it, how to view it in a very small domain. So it should run in a relatively short period of time, and you're able to get used to working with the HemeLB environment. And then the test case for the actual virtual case is an aneurysm. So the domain that we're looking at is this domain here on the right. And so this is the basilar artery, and these are the two vessels coming out of the top of that, the bifurcation at the top of the basilar artery. So this is the same vessel that was being blocked in those stroke simulations that I was speaking on earlier. So we have, but in this case, yes, we have an aneurysm at the end of that vessel at the junction of the bifurcation. And so we have these cases. It will output some planes of information for you with the profile that you are provided with. And so you need to run this case on both the GPU and the CPU clusters, investigate how some choices of various simulation parameters impacts the performance of these. I would strongly suggest that you start with the CPU version first and then progress to the GPU version. The actual post-processing is the same between the two versions. The yeah, the actual output file formats are exactly the same between the CPU version and the GPU version. It's the execution of the kernels on the hardware that it has been altered between them. In terms of your submission, so I'll be looking for things like performance plots. So millions of lattice updates per second. So how does the performance change as you change between the number of CPUs or the number of hardware that's being used and those simulation parameters that we're looking at? The effects of any changes that are being made. So compare that to the base case, the default code, the non-modified code, and if you are making changes to the simulation parameters, for example, what effects are these? Doing some profiling as you're doing for both for these codes and the others, and some flow visualization. So at the output that comes out of it, can you make some interesting simulations and visualizations that are coming from this flow domain? So HemeLB, in summary, is a high-performance fluid dynamics code that has been optimized for 3D vascular simulations. It has demonstrated excellent scalability on CPU and GPU hardware. For practical applications, so there is a balance of knowledge transfer that must occur between both clinical and numerical experts in order to get the best benefits out of this virtual human twin idea. And overall, building trust in these methods will be crucial, and this comes down to validation, verification, uncertainty quantification tools to make sure we have a reliable and robust system to be used in the practical cases. So that's all the slides I had to speak through today. So I guess if there are any questions from the floor, I'm happy to take those. And otherwise, best of luck with the competition and hope things go well.
Thank you, John. Anyone, any questions? Feel free to ask or to write on the chat to you feel. In any case, don't if you're stuck, don't get stuck. Write for us on the Slack, and we'll try to help. John, I see 2 questions on the chat.
Yep. So first question. Apologies in advance for mispronouncing any names. Salman Sari, BGK collision kernel. Yes, the default one is what I would recommend. And Sergio, how can we calculate MLUPS in execution? So MLUPS is millions of lattice updates per second. So you want to know the number of sites in your domain. And so when you're executing a HemeLB output, when you run the simulation, one of the first pieces of information that is printed is the number of sites. So that gives you the number of sites in your domain. So you know how many iterations you're running for. So that gives you the number of lattice updates that you're doing. So number of iterations times the number of sites. So that's the total number of the lattice updates that you're doing. You record the simulation time, so how long it takes to conduct the simulation phase. And then, so you're dividing lattice updates per second and you're scaling it by million, because when you have tens of millions of sites, it's a bit more of a useful metric to handle. So MLUPS is calculated by lattice update, number of lattice sites in your domain times the number of iterations, divide by the simulation time in seconds, and then dividing by a million to convert it to MLUPS. Tobias, are there options in programming and its libraries that can affect accuracy? Okay, so I guess, like I said, I've said to a couple groups, so if you are going to tinker with things like accuracy, the options have a baseline case. And if you're making changes such as compiler options, make sure you're comparing to the baseline case of the default options that are provided. Sergio, again, as a follow-up, report output file. Okay, so yes, use the simulation time. That's the actual time to conduct the simulation. The total time includes any initialization time. So total is from when you start the HemeLB process to when it completes at the end, and there will be some period of initialization which For the tiny bifurcation case, might be a couple of seconds. For the virtual case, it could be 20 or 30 seconds to go through that initialization case. It depends on the resources used and the number of and the size of the domain. But for calculating the MLUPs, use the simulation time, which you can get from either the from the report.txt file or from the screen output. There'll be in the screen output, there is a simulation started banner. And so that tells you when the simulation starts, so you can get the start time, and then when the simulation ends, there's an end time. Sarge, I think I addressed that in the previous question. So the initialization time, when you're calculating performance node, just use the simulation time when you're calculating MLUPs. If you notice particular changes in the initialization time and how that actually compares, that is a useful thing to know about. And so if you notice a particular change with some options or changes that you're implementing, then discuss those. But in terms of the actual performance results that we're looking at, it's the simulation time lapse results that we're looking at. Okay, we have a question from Cao Yuxuan, baseline case. Okay, so yes, baseline case is with the version that is as per what's provided in the repository. The compiler, so on the cluster that you're using, the default, so GNU is a safe bet for compilers. Same with the OpenMP. I think were there instructions for that on the wiki, I fear, as a general thing? I'm just trying to remember. So I think for the GPU version, yeah, there's module loads in the build scripts for Romeo, for example, that load the appropriate libraries. Similar for the CPU version on Iris. So for the base compilers, yeah, so we have the module compilers on the wiki page that's pointing to the so it's using the Intel based compilers on the Iris code. So that should have the MPI within that rather than no open MPI. Okay, Tobias. Yep. So yeah, so Cao, if you look at the HemeLB wiki page, there's some module load instructions. I'll tell you which ones to use. Okay, so well, okay, Tobias. Okay, so I guess you're talking about the actual simulation results. So I'm not sure if I'll say a particular margin of error. So if it's because there's certainly state what errors there are if there are differences. If it's kind of machine zero differences, then yeah, that's it. That can be negligible. If we're talking a significant percentage by some sort of error norm that you're referring to, then that is worth noting. As a rule of thumb, if we say it's less than 1% difference to something, then they can be considered identical. But yeah, if depending on what optimizations you conduct, there may be differences. So again, when you're presenting results, discuss what differences you see and yeah, what consequences that may have. Okay, I think there's no other questions that have bounced in as yet along the way. If you do have other questions that come up along the way, yeah, message me in the, or put a message in the Slack and we can try and clarify things. Okay, yes, simulation total, yeah.
So for the question on the Slack, the best way is to use the team Slack channel. So all the developers are there, and we can try to address it as soon as we can for future questions. Okay. Okay, so if no more questions, we'd like to thank John and thank you all for joining, and join us in about 15 minutes to the open forum session, the last session we have with Mark Wasserman. Okay. So again, thanks everyone for joining, and see you in about 15 minutes. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.